Hey there. So welcome back. If you haven't been here before, I am Susan Clifton. I'm a South Florida artist, and I aspire to teach people of all skill levels how to do mixed media art. Specifically jelly prints, collage, those types of things. You don't have to be able to draw. I get people saying all the time, I can't even draw a straight line. Well, you don't need to draw a straight line. Straight lines are boring. But today we're going to talk about pulling a single jelly print. So we are going to do layers, but we're going to only pull it once. I want you to understand how layers work on a jelly print. So here's your plate, and whatever is the first layer is going to be what shows up on top when you pull it. So let's say you're going to do 3 layers. Whatever you want to be the dominant top layer, you would put on first. And then your middle layer, and then your third layer, and then you pull. So that third layer might show the least because you have all this other paint. The other thing you have to be worried about is the transparency of the paint, because then they're going to kind of mix. They're not going to be, hopefully each layer is going to be dry, but they are still going to mix. And you can sort of, when you're working, you can look underneath and peek on the underside to see if you're getting the result that you want. But you always have to worry about 2 things: transparency, opaqueness, and what you want to show through your designs. So I find it easiest to work with a ghost print as my first layer, which is going to show on top. The second layer could have a stamp, because if you try to do it with a stencil, and you will see that in this video, when you try to do it with a stencil, the stencil pulls paint off of your plate. And so that sometimes can be a problem, sometimes it's a happy accident, but you just don't know what's going to happen. But if you're using a stamp on that second layer, then it'll work better. Your third layer is just going to be paint. So it'll just be a nice, even, flat, thin coat of paint that's going to show through all those little openings that you created with your stamp. Let's get started. So on this very first one that I'm doing, I'm using some stencils that I have, that I created on my Cricut, and I am pushing the paint through the openings. I'm just making sure I'm getting good coverage. And then I'm using a stamp just to sort of get some textures within the circles before it dries. And now I'm going to wait for it to dry, probably like about 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes. So once it's dry, I'm going over, my second layer is going to be yellow. Now if the first layer was not dry, I would have had a green mess here, because the yellow would have mixed with the blue, so you really do have to wait for it to dry. So now I'm putting the stencil over the yellow paint, and I'm going to use a clean sheet just to pull out the paint from the openings, leaving a ghost print on my second layer. So I'm really pushing through all of those openings, making sure I'm getting a clean ghost print. And now I'm going to leave this to dry again for 4 to 5 minutes. Third layer is going to be my teal. Now teal is a much more opaque color. The yellow is very transparent. And as you can see, the teal is very, very opaque. So now while it's still wet, I'm going to pull all 3 layers. Sometimes I peek a little bit. If it doesn't look like it's ready, I start You know, I feel it to see if it's still cool. And now I can pull. So that yellow was a little bit too transparent because it made a subtle pattern there. But I think it looks good. So on my next one, I'm going to start with Titan Buff. So I'm going to go light on top. And I have this delicate pattern. So both the inner openings and the design are both kind of fine. And I'm using some rice paper to really make sure that I get all the paint out of those openings, leaving me with a nice clean ghost print. So sometimes you really have to get into those little openings and keep cleaning. And as you'll notice, I didn't clean my plate. Those little scabs, or whatever you want to call them, they'll be fine. So this was golden fluid paint, so it dries pretty quickly. So I'm not waiting, and it's not a lot of paint on the plate, so I'm not waiting like 5 minutes. And I'm putting teal. Like I said before, teal is opaque. And that Titan Buff is going to show up nicely on it. So I'm stamping on this layer so that I will have some openings that my other color will show through. That will be my third layer. I like this stamp. It's just got like this chevron pattern. It's very subtle. It's also a little bit rustic. Now, again, I'm going to let this one dry. This has to dry completely. So now I'm going with a much darker blue. This is the Phtalo. I will put the link in the description below. Just doing a thin layer. And without waiting for it to dry, I'm now going to pull all the layers. And I'm using rice paper this time. I think the first one that I did was copy paper. I'll put a link for the rice paper that I use as well. Copy paper, I just go to Office Depot and buy whatever's on sale. This came out really pretty. See how subtle that darker blue in the background is? It's just peeking through that little stamp that I put there. I thought this came out really good. Okay, so now we're going to start with yellow. I think this is the one. First of all, I did not clean my brayer, so I had a little blue left over on there and it was still very wet and it mixed and gave me some green. So sometimes you have to just go with it. I decided to just go with it anyway. I meant to start with a nice clean yellow, but it didn't happen. So I'm just using a clean up sheet, and I also am starting with a ghost print, and I've got this little mixture of yellow and green going on, so it might be pretty. But you know, we have to be patient sometimes when we're doing these things. So now I'm doing quinacridone nickel azo gold, and I have waited for this to dry. I think this might be a pretty color, but they're also, both of these paints on the first 2 layers are transparent, so keep that in mind when you see the results. And I'm just using something I found around the house to make circles. I tried the bottom of this container, but I didn't like it. So I went back to my little lid. Turns out it makes really good circles. So I was looking for something simple to use as a stamp. So now, after it's all dry, I am using Titan Buff as my pickup layer. So this is going to be, it's a nice, opaque background, and or semi-opaque. I don't think it's as opaque as the teal. And I'm picking up some rice paper. So this video is like slightly sped up, just so that it wasn't an hour long. I had a very long jelly print session. And especially, it becomes even longer when you have to wait for each individual layer to dry. And my patience always gets tried during these sessions. So here I am pulling. This was a little bit of a disappointment for me, and I think it started with my dirty brayer at the very beginning. If I didn't have that green in there, I think I would have been very pleased with this. But the other thing that I didn't like was maybe starting with 2 transparent layers to start with. I think it's more successful when you have at least an opaque layer somewhere in between. So on this next one, I decided I wanted to see more contrast, so I'm starting with a carbon black. And I'm going with like a really geometric stencil. I'm just pulling up with some copy paper. And this print, this pull-up print that's just going to be an interim print, is going to be great collage paper. I love the super black and white contrast. Okay, so now we have a nice ghost print. And I waited for that to dry. And now I'm going to mix a little bit of cobalt blue and white, titanium white. I think I put a little bit too much paint, so I'm trying to get some off. And I'm using some bubble wrap. So now this is primary magenta. And I'm experimenting with different colors today just to see how they interact with each other. I wasn't really sure. Cobalt blue is not a color that I use a lot. So while this is still wet, obviously, I am going to pull up all 3 layers. This primary magenta was my final layer that I wanted as my pickup paint. So I was a little bit disappointed with this because I didn't think the primary magenta would have shown through quite so much. I thought it was just going to come through as those in that little bubble wrap, but it sort of took over. So this is why you have to experiment, because if you haven't used these two colors together in the past, you don't know what's going to happen until you do it. Okay, so let's do another one. I'm starting here with alizarin crimson. Not enough. Sometimes, you know, I always say less is more, and then if I need a little bit more, I add a little bit more. Because I get very upset when I put too much paint. So I'm going to use a cleanup sheet just to leave me with a ghost print. And again, I'm making sure I'm getting into all the little openings. I was being stingy with the rice paper today because I was running low, but rice paper will clean that up much quicker, especially since it's like a thinner paper. It's a little easier to get into the nooks and crannies. So I waited for it to dry completely. Also checking my brayer this time to make sure it's really dry. So I'm using these masks that I created with my Cricut. These were just free-form designs that I did on Procreate. And I'm using Titan Buff, which is semi-transparent. And this will be our next layer. And the color after that will show through where the mask is. So once again, I'm waiting for it to dry. And then I lift it up and just peek underneath. One of these days I'm going to get a piece of plexi to lay this on so that I could easily look underneath and see what kind of result I'm getting. So I'm using this yellow oxide. It came out in a big glob. So I am going to spend some time removing the paint and getting it down to a nice thin coat. Okay, so now while it's still wet, I'm using some copy paper and I'm pulling all 3 layers. So it looks like that yellow oxide was a little transparent. It looks like I probably could have used a more opaque paint and it would be less subtle, but I'm very happy with this result. I think it would be really nice collage paper. Okay, so let's do one more. I'm going to start with some carbon black. And this time I'm going to use some masks. And of course, I want to start with the ghost print, so I'm going to pull up this background. And this will also make some very nice collage paper. I mean, look at that. Love it. And a really nice ghost print. So of course I waited for it to dry. I'm going to keep repeating that. And I'm going to do something a little more colorful. And I'm not really going to mix these colors too much. I want them to sort of just be randomly brayered out, a little bit blotchy, a little overlap. Hopefully I'm not mixing it too much. So I'm using my cardboard to give me some vertical lines overlapping, just as my, and this time I am not putting another color on top. I'm just going to pull these 2 layers, because in this case I only needed the 2 layers. Like it. I like it a lot. Look at the way those transparent colors blended together and that splash of teal. So here's what we have. That was our first print with the dots. This was our more subtle pattern, starting with light. This one, still not very happy with that one. That one I think I can definitely use in collage. I like that one too. So we had some very good results this time. I'm very happy. So thanks for watching this video. I hope it helps you understand the way a jelly print works. I've seen other people's videos where they don't understand why they can't see a color that they laid down. Well, it's because the first layer is what's going to show on top. It builds from there. And your last layer, you might see very little of it, depending on the transparency of your paint. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit more. And don't forget, dry a lot in between each layer, like at least 5 minutes. I was a little impatient and sometimes my paints mixed a little bit. There was that one where the yellow and green, because my brayer wasn't completely wiped off. So, you know, you can end up messing up a print because you didn't have patience. So have patience, clean in between, and wait for it to dry. So hopefully you understand now the mystery between layering with one pull. So I'll see you next time, and don't forget, create, inspire, and share. Take care. Bye-bye.